Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. In today's lesson, I shall talk over a very important concept of English literature, and it is the characteristics of Neoclassicism in general and Neoclassical poetry of 18th century to be specific. Let's begin our discussion with the term Neoclassicism itself. The term Neoclassicism is a combination of two words. Neo, which means young or new, while the word classic refers to the style and works of the ancient authors of Greece and Rome. So, if we combine these words, we get the meaning of Neoclassicism as the rebirth, as the restoration of classicism. Hence, Neoclassicism is the movement in the history of English literature which laid immense emphasis on revival of the classical spirit, the classical literature, the concept of classical literature. It flourished roughly between 1660, when the Stuarts returned to the throne of England, and the 1798, which was the year of publication of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads that came to be seen as heralding the beginning of Romantic era. Regarding English literature, the Neoclassical age is typically divided into three periods. The first one is the Restoration Age, or the age of John Dryden. That means it is from 1660 to 1770. The second one is the Augustan Age, or the age of Pope Alexander Pope. It is from 1700 to 1750. And the last one is the age of sensibility, or the age of Johnson, from 1750 to 1798. This is the span of the last part. So why did Neoclassicism appear in England? The Neoclassicism movement was in part a reaction to the bold egocentrism of the Renaissance that saw man as larger than life and boundless in potential. The Neoclassicists directed their attention to a smaller scaled concept of man as an individual within a larger social context, seeing human nature as dualistic, flawed, and needing to be curbed by reason and decorum. In the field of literature, about the middle of 17th century, a change came over the English poetic temperament. The metaphysical wave had exhausted itself. There was nothing new, and had left literary standards and values confused. Ben Jonson, with prophetic vision, had seen this danger and also shown a way out from this danger. While the older Elizabethans were drawing their inspiration from the matter of the Greek and Latin classics, which was made available to them by the Renaissance, Ben Jonson found his own sustenance in their form, in the structure, technique of the classical writing. In other words, he preferred literary order and discipline to lawless impulse and unbridled, excessive fancy. The return to a great restraint and more rigid framework was accelerated by the powerful influence of French literary tastes on the English court, as a result of Charles II's long stay in France after the execution of his father Charles I. The French literary models were themselves derived from the classical literature. Very soon, the new or rather ancient spirit made itself felt in all branches of literary activity. Seneca provided the model for tragedy, Plautus and Terence for comedy, Virgil for epic and pastoral, Juvenal for satire, and Horace with his famous Ars Poetica for literary taste and criticism. The change involved the substitution of training for instinct, of conscious craftsmanship for erratic self-expression. So now I want to discuss about the precursors. Who were the precursors of the famous neoclassicist writers of 18th century? So here we have to think about Edmund Waller and Sir John Denham, who were the pioneers of the new movement. They led the reaction against metaphysical excesses by writing charming verse on the classical model. They were not great in their own right, but as their forerunner of Dryden and Pope, who both drew inspiration from these lesser poets. Among the comparatively small company of writers and readers in those days, a new fashion spread quickly, and the classical soon became the accepted mode. Its reign was long and remarkable. The restoration of monarchy in 1660 marked the beginning of neoclassical period in England. The neoclassicists looked to the great classical writers of ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration and guidance. Many poets practiced the imitation of masters and their preferred literary forms such as satire and the ode. They did it to perfect their own works and fostered proper mode of expression. Now let's find out the characteristics of neoclassical poetry, as poetry was the most dominant genre that this movement produced. The first one is the respect for rules. This is the first and foremost features of neoclassicism. The literary transition from Renaissance to the Restoration is a progressive movement towards a rule and a discipline, both in inspiration and form. This rule and discipline were accepted and practiced with enthusiasm by the new school. Classical conventions governed every variety of verse, drama, epic, satire, ode, or pastoral. Nothing that violated the law of its particular kind was good art. Perfect form was the ideal. The substance was of minor importance. The contrast between this cool control and the warmth and passion of the Elizabethans was indeed extreme. The second salient feature of this movement is the emphasis on correctness. Neoclassical poets emphasized on correctness. Correctness in this context means harmony, balance, order, serenity, decorum, strict care, accuracy in poetical technique, and humble imitation of the style of Latin classics. In keeping with its stress on naturalness of thought. The naturalness of style was also emphasized. The plain statement was preferred to the ornate style. Another outstanding hallmark of this neoclassical movement was its intellectual quality. The leading writers of this period shrank from all extravagance and emotionalism. They were governed by a spirit of reason and good sense, and above all things, correctness. Their poetry was bred more in the head than in the heart. It was addressed to the intellect, not to the feelings. Though Dryden and Pope, the masters of this school, often wrote on matters that roused deep emotions, but they never burst through the bonds of their form. The drama of their dealt with high passions, but with chilly classicism that gave it no appeal to later generations. What keeps the poems of these famous writers alive even today is the quality in which they themselves delighted in that age, and that is the wit, and it is present everywhere in their writing. They had a gift of pregnant and memorable phrase. Pope is more often quoted than any other English poet but Shakespeare, and many of his sayings are so familiar that we never think of their authorship. For example, little learning is a dangerous thing. It has almost become a proverb. The next prominent feature is the insistence on a set poetical style. The preoccupation with form encouraged an artificial style. The vocabulary must be neither colloquial nor technical. It had to be selected from what Dr. Johnson called a system of words at once refined from the grossness of domestic use and free from the harshness of terms appropriated to particular arts. That means technical term. Everyday speech was unacceptable, and so were novel expressions. Think how far this concept is from Wordsworth's concept of poetic language. The result was that in the work of all but the greatest masters, the language tended to be stilted and standardized. Another remarkable characteristic of this movement is the treatment of town life. London was a magnet for writers, each of whom hoped to find a patron to help him with money and influence in his career. The coffee house was the place where men of different professions, including authors, usually met to discuss the topics of the day. At one time, there were no fewer than 3,000 coffee houses in London, each with a flourishing trade. They served to establish contact not only between author and reader, but between author and author, sometimes to the lasting benefit of mankind. Dryden and Pope, for example, met first at a coffee house. All this had its influence on literature, which drew many of its subjects from town life rather than nature and the countryside. Satire came to be practiced more, and London life and current fashions and controversies offered it almost unlimited scope. Classical and French satirical masterpieces supplied the necessary model. So we can here clearly understand how far different is this literature from the literature of the Romantic age. Another striking trait of neoclassical poetry is the emergence of the heroic couplet. The best medium for realizing the poetical ideals, the poetical standard of the time proved to be the heroic couplet, the two iambic pentameter lines which rhymed together. It was suitable for drama, for epic and for satire, the three most widely practiced literary forms of this period. It had rules of its own, initiated by Waller and Denham, and later systematized by Dryden and Pope. Precise and unimpassioned, the heroic couplet came to seem the natural expression of the intellectual mood of this age. Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock offers an example of the grandest use of heroic couplet. Didacticism is another arresting mark of the literature that this movement produced. Neoclassical poets thought that literature should both instruct and delight. This didactic tone can be easily found in the poetry of Dryden and Pope. The last but not the least point is the impersonal tone that we can find in the poetry of neoclassical period. In Romantic poetry, the poet expresses his or her personal reflection and deeply felt responses to the world. In the 18th century, however, poetry was treated as a more public form of expression appropriate to all manners of everyday topics such as politics, money, gardening, manners, theology, weather, fishing, philosophy, scientific innovation, drinking, and so on. Thus, the range of subject matter addressed in verse was really extremely wide. Topics were often approached in quite commonplace, but never personal. Even the periodical essay is a literary form that served the public sphere. Now we are almost at the end of our discussion. To summarize the whole matter, I can say here that the new spirit, that means the neoclassical spirit, is above all critical and analytic, not creative and sympathetic. It brings the intellect rather than the poetic imagination into play, into work. The neoclassical poetry deals with manners and superficialities rather than with eternal elemental things and the larger issues of life. And this backdrop, this drawback has been identified by Wordsworth. The object of the leading poets was to avoid extravagance and emotionalism. In many cases, they suppressed altogether the emotional and the basic qualities of good poetry. They resurrected the classical values of unity and proportion and saw their art as a way to entertain and inform, a depiction of humans as social creatures as part of polite society. The brooding social unrest that culminated in revolutions in the end of 18th century that we find in American colonies and in the France toppled, destroyed this artificial refinement at the end of 18th century. So I am concluding my discussion here. If you like this lesson, please hit the like button. Please show some support for me. If you still have any doubt or query, you can ask me in the comment section. I also request you to consider to subscribe to my channel, where you will get a regular update of this kind of quality content. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.